And welcome once again to Moonlight Frights. As always, I'm your host, Peter Yakovetsky. We've got a good collection of things on for today. We're even going to have a story by Robert Louis Stevenson, who you don't usually think of as horror, but I mean, read some of the chapters from Kidnapped or Treasure Island. The guy could do horror. And he did in one of his stories. It's not the first thing we're going to be doing. The first thing, let me just find it, is by Guy de Maupassant, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. It's French. I think I got it right, though. I looked it up. And this is his story, Was It a Dream? So we're going to cut right to the chase on this one. And, of course, in the second half, we will be continuing with the great god Pan. But in the meantime, on page 175... Was It a Dream? By Guy de Maupassant. Pardon. I loved her madly. Why does one love? Why does one love? How strange it is to see but one being in the world, to have but one thought in one's mind, one desire in the heart, and one name on the lips, a name that comes up continually, rising from the depths of the soul like water in a spring, and which one repeats over and over again and murmurs ceaselessly everywhere, like a prayer. I am not going to tell you our story. Love is always the same. I met her and loved her, that is all. And for a whole year I lived in her tenderness, her caresses, in her arms. I hung on her words and looks, loved her dresses, was so completely wrapped up, bound, imprisoned in everything that pertained to her, that I no longer knew whether it was day or night, or if I was dead or alive, on this old earth of ours or elsewhere. And then she died. How? I do not know. I no longer know. But one evening she came home wet, for it was raining heavily, and the next day she coughed. And she coughed for about a week, and took to her bed. What happened I do not remember now, but doctors came, wrote prescriptions, and went away. Medicines were brought, and a woman made her drink them. Her hands were hot, her forehead was burning, and her eyes bright and sad. When I spoke to her, she answered me, but I do not remember what we said. I have forgotten everything. 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 She died, and I very well remember her little faint sigh, her last. The nurse said, "Ah," and I understood. I understood. I knew nothing more. Nothing. I saw a priest who said, "Your sweetheart," and it seemed to me as if he were insulting her. And as she was dead, nobody had the right to know our relationship, and I turned him out. Another came, who was very kind and tender, and I shed tears when he spoke to me about her. They consulted me about the funeral, but I do not remember anything that they said, though I distinctly recall the coffin, and the strokes of the hammer as they nailed her down in it. Oh, God! God! She was buried. Buried! She! In that hole. Some people came. Female friends. I made my escape and ran away. I ran, and then I walked through the streets and finally went home. The next day I started on a journey. Yesterday I returned to Paris, and when I saw my room again, our room, our bed, our furniture, everything that remains of the life of a human being after death, I was seized by such a violent recurrence of grief that I came very near to opening the window and throwing myself out into the street. I could no longer remain in the midst of these things, between these walls which had enclosed and sheltered her, and which retained 1,000 atoms of her skin, and of her breath, and their imperceptible crevices. I took up my hat to make my escape, and just as I reached the door, I passed the large glass in the hall, which she had put there so she could look at herself every day from head to foot as she went out, to see if her toilette was in order, and was correct and pretty, from her little boots to her hat. And I stopped short in front of that looking-glass in which she had so often been reflected, so often that it must also have retained her reflection. I was standing there, trembling, with my eyes fixed on the glass, on that flat, profound, empty glass, which had contained her entirely and had possessed her as much as I had, as my passionate looks had. I felt as if I loved that glass. I touched it. It was cold. Oh, the recollection. Sorrowful mirror, burning mirror, live mirror, horrible mirror which makes us suffer such torments. Happy are the men whose hearts is like a mirror where images glide and pass away, that forgets all it has contained, reflected, all that have basked in its love and affection. But I, how I suffer. I went out and, without knowing it, without wishing it, walked to the cemetery. I found her simple grave, a white marble cross with these few words: she loved, was beloved, and died. She was there, beneath the ground, decomposed. How horrible. I sobbed, with my forehead to the ground. I remained there a long time. A long time. Then I saw that it was getting dark, and a strange, mad wish, the desire of a despairing lover, seized me. I wished to pass the night, the last night, in weeping on her grave. But I should be seen and driven out. How was I to manage? I was cunning, so I got up and began to roam about that city of the dead. I walked and walked. How small this city is in comparison with the other, the city in which we live. And yet, how much more numerous the dead are than the living. We require high houses, wide streets, and much room for the 4 generations who see the daylight at the same time, drink water from the spring, wine from the vines, and eat the bread from the plains. And for all the generations of the dead, for all that ladder of humanity that has descended to us, there is scarcely anything, only a field, scarcely anything. The earth takes them back, oblivion effaces them. Adieu. At the end of this cemetery, I suddenly perceived the abandoned cemetery where the dead have long since blended with the soil, where the crosses themselves decay, where the last comers will be put tomorrow. It is full of untended roses, of robust, dark cypress trees, a sad and beautiful garden nourished on human flesh. I was alone, perfectly alone. I hid in a leafy tree and concealed myself completely among the thick and somber branches and waited, clinging to the trunk as a shipwrecked man does to a plank. When it was quite dark, I left my refuge and began to walk slowly, softly, noiselessly through that ground full of dead people, and I wandered about for a long time but could not find her again. I went on with extended arms, knocking against the tombs with my hands, my feet, my chest, even with my head, without being able to find her. I touched and felt about like a blind man groping his way. I felt the stones, the crosses, the iron railings, the metal wreaths, and the wreaths of faded flowers. I read the names with my fingers by passing them over the letters. What a night! What a night! I could not find her again. There was no moon. What a night! I was afraid, horribly afraid, in these narrow paths between 2 rows of graves. Graves! 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 Nothing but graves! On my right, on my left, in front of me, around me, everywhere, there were graves. I sat down on one of them, for I could not walk any longer. My knees were so weak. I could hear my heart beat. and I could hear something else as well. What? A confused, nameless noise. Was the noise in my head, in the impenetrable night, or beneath the mysterious earth, the earth sown with human corpses? I looked about me, but I cannot say how long I remained there. I was paralyzed with terror, drunk with fright, ready to shout out, ready to die. Suddenly, it seemed to me as if the slab of marble on which I was sitting was moving. Certainly, it was moving, as if it were being raised. With a bound, I sprang onto the neighboring tomb, and I saw, yes, I distinctly saw the stone which I had just left standing upright, and the dead person appeared, a naked skeleton that was pushing the stone back with its bent back. I saw it clearly, although the night was dark. On the cross I read, "Here lies Jacques Soliviant, who died at the age of 51. He loved his family, was kind and honorable, and died in the peace of the Lord." The dead man also read what was inscribed on his tombstone. Then he picked up a stone off the path, a little pointed stone, and began to scrape the letters carefully. He slowly effaced them all together, and with the hollows of his eyes he looked at the places where they had been engraved, and, with the tip of the bone that had been his forefinger, he wrote in luminous letters like those lines which one traces on walls with the tip of a lucifer match. "Here reposes Jacques Soliviant, who died at the age of 51. He hastened his father's death by his unkindness, as he wished to inherit his fortune. He tortured his wife, tormented his children, deceived his neighbors, robbed everyone he could, and died wretched." When he had finished writing, the dead man stood motionless, looking at his work, and turning round, I saw that all the graves were open, that all the dead bodies had emerged from them, and that all had effaced the lies inscribed on the gravestones by their relations, and had substituted the truth instead. And I saw that all had been the tormentors of their neighbors, malicious, dishonest hypocrites, liars, rogues, calumniators, envious, that they had stolen, deceived, performed every disgraceful, every abominable action. These good fathers, these faithful wives, these devoted sons, these chaste young girls, these honest tradesmen, these men and women who are called irreproachable. And they were all writing at the same time on the threshold of their eternal abode the truth, the cruel, terrible, and holy truth which everyone on earth is ignorant of or pretends to ignore. I thought that she, also, must have written something on her tombstone, and now running without any fear among the half-open coffins, among the corpses and skeletons, I went toward her, sure that I should find her immediately. I recognized her at once, without seeing her face, which was covered by the winding sheet, and on the marble cross, where shortly before I had read, "She loved, was beloved, and died," I now read, "Having gone out one day in order to deceive her lover, she caught cold in the rain and died. It appears that they found me at daybreak, lying on the grave unconscious." And that was It a Dream? By Guy de Maupassant. And despite the trappings of your traditional gothic horror, the dead rising from the grave and fleshless skeletons at midnight, a man trapped in a graveyard succumbing slowly to paranoia, it fits more into what I've called in the show before the horror of despair. Especially since as the title implies, was it a dream? Did he really see all this? Was he involved in the supernatural? I mean, it's possible considering the genre we're in. But was it just a dream born out of despair of her, and was it an attempt to make himself no longer feel so bad? Oh, I don't need to weep, she wasn't true at all? Or did he have that niggling little doubt that nothing was perfect? Why did he throw out the priest? There is the despair, though, the no one is good, nothing lasts, all that you think that you love will deceive you. And of course, what does that make you? What does that leave you? Are you as good as you say you are? So there's a despairedness to that, which adds to a delightfully gothic and horrific tone of the whole thing. Alright, we're going to move on to Robert Louis Stevenson's The Body Snatcher as soon as I get to the right page. This is a large book, and it's page 200. Excuse me, I'm coming down from a cold. But here we are. The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson. Every night in the year, 4 of us sat in the small parlor of the George at Debenham, the undertaker and the landlord and Fettes and myself. Sometimes there would be more, but blow high, blow low, come rain or snow or frost, we 4 would be each planted in his own particular armchair. Fettes was an old drunken Scotchman, a man of education obviously, and a man of some property since he lived in idleness. He had come to Debenham years ago while still young, and by mere continuance of living had grown to be an adopted townsman. His blue camlet cloak was a local antiquity, like the church spire. His place in the parlor at the George, his absence from church, his old, crapulous, disreputable vices, were all things of course in Debenham. He had some vague, radical opinions, and some fleeting infidelities, which he would now and again set forth and emphasize with tottering slaps upon the table. He drank rum, 5 glasses regularly every evening, and for the greater portion of his nightly visit to the George, sat, with his glasses in his right hand, in a state of melancholy alcoholic saturation. We called him the doctor, for he was supposed to have some special knowledge of medicine, and had been known, upon a pinch, to set a fracture or reduce a dislocation. But beyond these slight particulars, we had no knowledge of his character and antecedents. One dark winter night, it had struck 9 some time before the landlord joined us, there was a sick man in the George. A great neighbouring proprietor suddenly struck down with apoplexy on his way to Parliament, and the great man's still greater London doctor had been telegraphed to his bedside. It was the first time that such a thing had happened in Debenham, for the railway was but newly opened, and we were all proportionately moved by the occurrence. "He's come," said the landlord, after he had filled and lighted his pipe. "He?" said I. "Who? Not the doctor?" "Himself," replied our host. "What is his name?" "Dr. Macfarlane," said the landlord. Fettes was far through his 3rd number, stupidly fuddled, now nodding over, now staring mazily around him. But at the last word he seemed to awaken, and repeated the name Macfarlane twice, quietly enough the first time, but with sudden emotion at the second. "Yes," said the landlord, "that's his name, Dr. Wolfe Macfarlane." Fettes became instantly sober. His eyes awoke, his voice became clear, loud and steady, his language forcible and earnest. We all were startled by this transformation, as if the man had risen from the dead. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I am afraid I have not been paying much attention to your talk. Who is this Wolfe Macfarlane?" And then, when he had heard the landlord out, "It cannot be. It cannot be," he added. "And yet, I would like well to see him face to face." "Do you know him, doctor?" asked the undertaker with a gasp. "God forbid," was the reply. "And yet, the name is a strange one. It were too much to fancy, too. Tell me, landlord, is he old?" "Well," said the host, "he's not a young man, to be sure, and his hair is white, but he looks younger than you." "He is older, though. Years older. But," with a slap upon the table, "it's the rum you see in my face. Rum and sin. This man, perhaps, may have an easy conscience and good digestion. Conscience? Hear me speak. You would think I was some good, old, decent Christian, would you not? But no, not I. I never canted. Voltaire might have canted if he'd stood in my shoes, but the brains, with a rattling fillip on his bald head, the brains were clear and active, and I saw and made no deductions. If you know this, Doctor, I ventured to remark, after a somewhat awful pause, I should gather that you do not share the landlord's good opinion. Fettes paid no regard to me. Yes, he said with a sudden decision. I must see him face to face. There was another pause, and then a door was closed rather sharply on the first floor, and a step was heard upon the stair. That's the doctor, cried the landlord. Look sharp, and you can catch him. It was but 2 steps from the small parlor to the door of the Old George Inn. The wide oak staircase landed almost in the street. There was room for a turkey rug and nothing more between the threshold and the last round of the descent, but this little space was every evening brilliantly lit up. Not only by the light upon the stair and the great signal lamp below the sign, but by the warm radiance of the bar-room window. The George thus brightly advertised itself to passers-by in the cold street. Fettes walked steadily to the spot, and we, who were hanging behind, beheld the 2 men meet, as one of them had phrased it, face to face. Dr. McFarlane was alert and vigorous. His white hair set off his pale and placid, although energetic, countenance. He was richly dressed in the finest of broadcloth and the whitest of linen, with a great gold watch chain and studs and spectacles of the same precious material. He wore a broad folded tie, white and speckled with lilac, and he carried on his arm a comfortable driving coat of fur. There was no doubt but he became his years, breathing as he did of wealth and consideration, and it was a surprising contrast to see our parlor sot, bald, dirty, pimpled, and robed in his own camlet cloak, confront him at the bottom of the stairs. McFarlane, he said somewhat loudly, more like a herald than a friend. The great doctor pulled up short on the 4th step, as though the familiarity of the address surprised and somewhat shocked his dignity. Toddy McFarlane, repeated Fettes. The London man almost staggered. He stared for the swiftest of seconds at the man before him, glanced behind him with a sort of scare, and then in a startled whisper, Fettes, he said. You? Aye, said the other. Me? Did ye think I was dead too? We are not so easy shut of our acquaintance. Hush, hush, exclaimed the doctor. Hush, hush. This meeting is so unexpected. I can see you are unmanned. I hardly knew you, I confess, at first, but I am overjoyed to have this opportunity. For the present, it must be how do you do and goodbye in one, for my fly is waiting, and I must not fail the train, but you shall, let me see. Yes, you shall give me your address, and you can count on early news of me. We must do something for you, Fettes. I fear you are out at elbows, but we must see for that for old Lang Syne, as we once sang at suppers. Money, cried Fettes. Money from you? The money that I had from you is lying where I cast it in the rain. Dr. McFarlane had talked himself into some measure of superiority and confidence, but the uncommon energy of this refusal cast him back into his first confusion. A horrible, ugly look came and went across his almost venerable countenance. My dear fellow, he said, be it as you please. My last thought is to offend you. I would intrude on none. I will leave you my address, however. I do not wish it. I do not wish to know the roof that shelters you, interrupted the other. I heard your name. I feared it might be you. I wish to know if, after all, there were a God. I know now that there is none. Begone! He stood still in the middle of the rug, between the stair and the doorway, and the great London physician, in order to escape, would be forced to step to one side. It was plain that if he hesitated before the thought of this humiliation, while as he was, there was a dangerous glitter in his spectacles. But while he still paused uncertain, he became aware that the driver of his fly was peering in from the street at this unusual scene, and caught a glimpse at the same time of our little body from the parlor. I'm going to pause this for a moment because I'm about to sneeze. And we're back. Sorry about that. Momentarily was overcome. As I said, I was coming down from a cold, had to sneeze, had to blow my nose. We're back now, though. I'll spare you the gruesome details. Now, where were we? White as he was, there was a dangerous glitter in his spectacles, but while he still paused uncertain, he became aware that the driver of his fly was peering in from the street at this unusual scene, and caught a glimpse at the same time of our little body from the parlor, huddled by the corner of the bar. The presence of so many witnesses decided him at once to flee. He crouched together, brushing on the wainscot, and made a dart like a serpent, striking for the door. But his tribulation was not entirely at an end, for even as he was passing, Fettes clutched him by the arm, and these words came in a whisper, and yet painfully distinct. "Have you seen it again?" The great, rich London doctor cried out aloud with a sharp, throttling cry. He dashed his questioner across the open space and, with his hands over his head, fled out of the door like a detected thief. But it occurred to one of us to make a movement. But before it had occurred to one of us to make a movement, the fly was already rattling toward the station. The scene was over like a dream, but the dream had left proofs and traces of its passage. Next day, the servant found the fine gold spectacles broken on the threshold, and that very night we were all standing breathless by the barroom window, and Fettes at our side, sober, pale, and resolute in look. "God protect us, Mr. Fettes," said the landlord, coming first into possession of his customary senses. "What in the universe is all this? These are strange things you have been saying." Fettes turned towards us. He looked at us each in succession in the face. "See if you can hold your tongues," said he. "That man MacFarlane is not safe to cross. Those that have done so already have repented it too late." And then, without so much as finishing his third glass, far less waiting for the other two, he bade us goodbye and went forth, under the lamp of the hotel, into the black night. We three turned to our places in the parlor, with the big red fire and the 4 clear candles, and as we recapitulated what had passed, the first chill of our surprise soon changed into a glow of curiosity. We sat late. It was the latest session I have ever known in the Old George. Each man, before we parted, had his theory that he was bound to prove, and none of us had any nearer business in this world than to track out the past of our condemned companion, and surprise the secret that he shared with the great London doctor. It is no great boast, but I believe I was a better hand at worming out a story than either of my fellows at the George, and perhaps there is now no other man alive who could narrate to you the following foul and unnatural events. In his young days, Fettes studied medicine in the schools of Edinburgh. He had a talent of a kind, the talent that picks up swiftly what it hears and readily retails it for its own. He worked a little at home, but he was civil, attentive, and intelligent in the presence of his masters. They soon picked him out as a lad who listened closely and remembered well. Nay, strange as it seemed to me when I first heard it, he was in those days well favored and pleased by his exterior. There was at that period a certain extramural teacher of anatomy, whom I shall here designate by the letter K. His name was subsequently too well known. The man who bore it skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution of Burke called loudly for the blood of his employer. But Mr. K was then at the top of his vogue. He enjoyed a popularity due partly to his own talent and addresses, partly to the incapacity of his rival, the university professor. The students, at least, swore by his name, and Fettes believed himself, and was believed by others, to have laid the foundations of success when he had acquired the favor of this meteorically famous man. Mr. K was a bon vivant, as well as an accomplished teacher. He liked a sly illusion no less than a careful preparation. In both capacities, Fettes enjoyed and deserved his notice, and by the second year of his attendance he held the half-regular position of second demonstrator, or sub-assistant, in his class. In this capacity, the charge of the theatre and lecture-room devolved in particular upon his shoulders. He had to answer for the cleanliness of the premises and the conduct of the other students, and it was part of his duty to supply, receive, and divide the various subjects. It was with a view to this last, at that time very delicate, affair, that he was lodged by Mr. K in the same wind, and at last in the same building with the dissecting rooms. Here, after a night of turbulent pleasures, his hands still tottering, his sight still misty and confused, he would be called out of bed in the black hours before the winter dawn by the unclean and desperate interlopers who supplied the table. He would open the door to these men, since infamous throughout the land. He would help them with their tragic burden, pay them their sordid price, and remain alone when they were gone with the unfriendly relics of humanity. From such a scene he would return to snatch another hour or two of slumber, to repair the abuses of the night, and refresh himself for the labors of the day. Few lads could have been more insensible to the impressions of a life thus passed among the ensigns of mortality. His mind was closed against all general considerations. He was incapable of interest in the fate and fortunes of another, the slave of his own desires and low ambitions. Cold, light, and selfish in the last resort, he had that modicum of prudence, miscalled morality, which keeps a man from inconvenient drunkenness or punishable theft. He coveted, besides, a measure of consideration from his masters and his fellow pupils, and he had no desire to fail conspicuously in the external parts of life. Thus he made it his pleasure to gain some distinction in his studies, and day after day rendered unimpeachable eye service to his employer, Mr. K. For his day of work, he indemnified himself by nights of roaring, blackguardly employment, and when that balance had been struck, the organ that he called his conscience declared itself content. The supply of subjects was a continual trouble to him as well as to his master. In that large and busy class, the raw material of the anatomists kept perpetually running out. and the business thus rendered necessary was not only unpleasant in itself, but threatened dangerous consequences to all who were concerned. It was the policy of Mr. K to ask no questions in his dealing with the trade. "They bring the body, and we pay the price," he used to say, dwelling on the alliteration quid pro quo. And again, somewhat profanely, "Ask no questions," he would tell his assistants, "for conscience sake." There was no understanding that the subjects were provided by the crime of murder. Had that idea been broached to him in words, he would have recoiled in horror, but the lightness of his speech upon so grave a matter was, in itself, an offense against good manners, and a temptation to the men with whom he dealt. Frights, for instance, had often remarked to himself upon the singular freshness of the bodies. He had been struck again and again by the hang-dog, abominable looks of the ruffians who came to him before the dawn, and putting things together clearly in his private thoughts, he perhaps attributed a meaning too immoral and too categorical to the unguarded counsels of his master. He understood his duty, in short, to have three branches: to take what was brought, to pay the price, and to avert the eye from any evidence of crime. One November morning, this policy of silence was put sharply to the test. He had been awake all night with a racking toothache, pacing his room like a caged beast, or throwing himself in fury on his bed, and had fallen at last into that profound, uneasy slumber that so often follows on a night of pain, when he was awakened by the third or fourth angry repetition of the concerted signal. There was a thin, bright moonshine. It was a bitter cold, windy and frosty. The town had not yet awakened, but an indefinable stir already precluded the noise and business of the day. The ghouls had come later than usual, and they seemed more than usually eager to be gone. Frights, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard their grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and as they stripped the sack from their sad merchandise, he leaned, dozing, with his shoulder propped against the wall. He had to shake himself to find the men their money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started. He took 2 steps nearer with the candle raised. "God Almighty!" he cried. "That is Jane Galbraith!" The men answered nothing, but they shuffled nearer the door. "I know her, I tell you," he continued. "She was alive and hearty yesterday. It's impossible she can be dead. It's impossible you should have got this body fairly." "Sure, sir, you're mistaken entirely," said one of the men. But the other one looked Frights darkly in the eyes and demanded the money on the spot. It was impossible to misconceive the threat or to exaggerate the danger. The lad's heart failed him. He stammered some excuses, counted the sum, and saw his hateful visitors depart. No sooner were they gone than he hastened to confirm his doubts. By a dozen unquestionable marks upon her body that might well betoken violence. I'm sorry, I lost my place. By a dozen unquestionable marks, he identified the girl he had jested with the day before. He saw with horror marks upon her body that might well betoken violence. A panic seized him, and he took refuge in his room. There, he reflected at length over the discovery that he had made, considered soberly the bearing of Mr. K's instruction, and the danger to himself of interference in so serious a business, and at last, in sore perplexity, determined to wait for the advice of his immediate superior, the class assistant. This was a young doctor, Wolfe McFarlane, a high favorite among all the reckless students, clever, dissipated, and unscrupulous to the last degree. He had traveled and studied abroad. His manners were agreeable and a little forward. He was an authority on the stage, skillful on the ice or the links with skate or golf club. He dressed with nice audacity, and, to put the finishing touch upon his glory, he kept a gig and strong trotting horse. When With Fets, he was on terms of intimacy. Indeed, their relative positions called for some community. I keep losing my place. For some community of life, and when subjects were scarce, the pair would drive far into the country in McFarlane's gig, visit and desecrate some lonely graveyard, and return before dawn with their booty to the door of the dissecting room. On that particular morning, McFarlane arrived somewhat earlier than his wont. Fets heard him, and met him on the stairs, told him his story, and showed him the cause of his alarm. McFarlane examined the marks on her body. "Yes," he said with a nod. "It looks fishy." "Well, what should I do?" asked Fets. "Do?" repeated the other. "Do you want to do anything? Least said, soonest mended, I should say." "Someone else might recognize her," objected Fets. "She was as well known as the Castle Rock." "We'll hope not," said McFarlane. "And if anybody does, well, you didn't, don't you see, and there's an end. The fact is, this has been going on too long. Stir up the mud and you'll get Kay into the most unholy trouble. You'll be in a shocking box yourself. So will I, if you come to that. I should like to know how any of us would look, or what the devil we should say for ourselves in any Christian witness box. For me, there's one thing certain, that, practically speaking, all our subjects have been murdered." "McFarlane!" cried Fets. "Come now," sneered the other, "as if you hadn't suspected it yourself." "Suspecting is one thing, and proof another. Yes, I know. And I'm as sorry as you are that this should have come here," tapping the body with his cane. "The next best thing is for me not to recognize it, and," he added coolly, "I don't. You may, if you please. I don't dictate, but I think a man of the world would do as I do, and I may add, I fancy that is what Kay would look for at our hands. The question is, why did he choose us two for his assistants? And I answer, because he didn't want old wives." This was the tone of all others to affect the mind of a lad like Fets. He agreed to imitate McFarlane. The body of the unfortunate girl was duly dissected, and no one remarked or appeared to recognize her. One afternoon, when his day's work was over, Fets dropped into a popular tavern and found McFarlane sitting with a stranger. This was a small man, very pale and dark, with coal-black eyes. The cut of his features gave a promise of intellect and refinement, which was but feebly realized in his manners, for he proved, upon nearer acquaintance, coarse, vulgar, and stupid. He exercised, however, a very remarkable control over McFarlane, issued orders like the great Bashaw, became inflamed at the least discussion or delay, and commented rudely on the servility with which he was obeyed. This most offensive person took a fancy to Fets on the spot, plied him with drinks, and honored him with unusual confidences on his past career. If a tenth part of what he confessed were true, he was a very loathsome rogue, and the lad's vanity was tickled by the attention of so experienced a man. "I'm a pretty bad fellow myself," the stranger remarked, "but McFarlane is the boy. Toddy McFarlane, I call him. Toddy, order your friend another glass." Or it might be, "Toddy, you jump up and shut the door." "Toddy hates me," he said again. "Oh yes, Toddy, you do." "Don't you call me that confounded name," growled McFarlane. "Hear him! Did you ever see the lads play knife? He would like to do that all over my body," remarked the stranger. "We medicals have a better way than that," said Fets. "When we dislike a dead We medicals have a better way than that," said Fets. "When we dislike a dead friend of ours, we dissect him." McFarlane looked up sharply, as though this jest were scarcely to his mind. The afternoon passed. Gray, for that was the stranger's name, invited Fets to join them at dinner, ordered a feast so sumptuous that the tavern was thrown in commotion, and when all was done, commanded McFarlane to settle the bill. It was late before they separated. The man Gray was incapably drunk. McFarlane, sobered by his fury, chewed the cud of the money he had been forced to squander, and the slights he had been obliged to swallow. Fettes, with various liquors singing in his head, returned home with devious footsteps and a mind entirely in abeyance. Next day, McFarlane was absent from the class, and Fettes smiled to himself as he imagined him still squirreling the intolerable gray from tavern to tavern. As soon as the hour of liberty had struck, he posted from place to place in quest of his last night's companions. He could find them, however, nowhere, so he returned early to his rooms, went early to bed, and slept for the sleep of the just. At 4 a.m, he was awakened by the well-known signal. Descending to the door, he was filled with astonishment to find McFarlane with his gig, and in the gig one of those long and ghastly packages with which he was so well acquainted. "What?" he cried. "Have you been out alone? How did you manage?" But McFarlane silenced him roughly, bidding him turn to business. When they had got the body upstairs and laid it on the table, McFarlane made at first as if he were going away. Then he paused and seemed to hesitate, and then, "You had better look at the face," he said in tones of some constraint. "You had better," he repeated as Fettes only stared at him in wonder. "But where, and how, and when did you come by it?" cried the other. "Look at the face," was the only answer. Fettes was staggered. Strange doubts assailed him. He looked from the young doctor to the body and then back again. At last, with a start, he did as he was bidden. He had almost expected the sight that met his eyes, and yet the shock was cruel. To see, fixed in the rigidity of death and naked on that coarse layer of sackcloth, the man whom he had left well clad and full of meat and sin upon the threshold of a tavern, awoke even in the thoughtless Fettes some of the terrors of the conscience. It was a cras tibi which re-echoed in his soul that two whom he had known should have come to lie upon these icy tables. Yet these were only secondary thoughts. His first concern regarded Wolfe. Unprepared for a challenge so momentous, he knew not how to look his comrade in the face. He durst not meet his eye, and he had neither words nor voice at his command. It was McFarlane himself who made the first advance. He came up quietly behind and laid his hand gently but firmly on the other's shoulder. "Richardson," said he, "may have the head." Now Richardson was a student who had long been anxious for that portion of the human subject to dissect. There was no answer, and the murderer resumed. "Talking of business, you must pay me. Your accounts, you see, must tally." Fettes found a voice, the ghost of his own. "Pay you?" he cried. "Pay you for that?" "Why, yes, of course you must. By all means, and on every possible account, you must," returned the other. "I dare not give it for nothing. You dare not take it for nothing. It would compromise us both. This is another case like Jane Galbraith's. The more things are wrong, the more we must act as if all were right. Where does old K keep his money?" "There," answered Fettes hoarsely, pointing to a cupboard in the corner. "Give me the key, then," said the other, calmly, holding out his hand. There was an instant's hesitation, and the die was cast. McFarlane could not suppress a nervous twitch, the infinitesimal mark of an immense relief as he felt the key between his fingers. He opened the cupboard, brought out pen and ink and a paper book that stood in one compartment, and separated from the funds in a drawer a sum suitable to the occasion. "Now look here," he said. "There is the payment made. First proof of your good faith. First step to your security. You now have to clinch it by a second. Enter the payment in your book, and then you, for your part, may defy the devil." The next few seconds were for Fettes an agony of thought, but in balancing his terrors, it was the most immediate that triumphed. Any future difficulty seemed almost welcome if he could avoid a present quarrel with McFarlane. He set down the candle which he had been carrying all this time, and with a steady hand entered the date, the nature, and the amount of the transaction. And now, said McFarlane, it's only fair that you should pocket the lucre. I've had my share already. By the by, when a man of the world falls into a bit of luck, he has a few shillings extra in his pocket. I'm ashamed to speak of it, but there's a rule of conduct in the case. No treating, no purchase of expensive class books, no squaring old debts. Borrow, don't lend. McFarlane, began Fetz, still somewhat hoarsely, I have put my neck in a halter to oblige you. To oblige me? Cried Wolf. Oh, come. You did, as near as I can see the matter, what you downright had to do in self-defense. Suppose I got into trouble, where would you be? This second little matter flows clearly from the first. Mr. Gray is the continuation of Miss Galbraith. You can't begin and then stop. If you begin, you must keep on beginning. That's the truth. No rest for the wicked. A horrible sense of blackness and treachery of fate seized hold upon the soul of the unhappy student. My God, he cried, but what have I done? And when did I begin? To be made a class assistant in the name of reason, where's the harm in that? Service wanted the position. Service might have got it. Would he have been where I am now? My dear fellow, said McFarlane, what a boy you are. What harm has come to you? What harm can come to you if you hold your tongue? Why, man, do you know what this life is? There are two squads of us, the lions and the lambs. If you're a lamb, you'll come to lie upon these tables like Gray or Jane Galbraith. If you're a lion, you'll live and drive a horse like me, like Kay, like all the world with any wit or courage. You're staggered at the first, but look at Kay. My dear fellow, you're clever, you have pluck. I like you, and Kay likes you. You were born to lead the hunt, and I tell you on my honor and my experience of life, 3 days from now you'll laugh at all these scarecrows like a high school boy at a farce. And with that, McFarlane took his departure and drove off up the wind in his gig to get under cover before daylight. Fetz was thus left alone with his regrets. He saw the miserable peril in which he stood involved. He saw, with inexpressible dismay, that there was no limit to his weakness, and that, from concession to concession, he had fallen from the arbiter of McFarlane's destiny to his paid and helpless accomplice. He would have given the world to have been a little braver at the time, but it did not occur to him that he might still be brave. The secret of Jane Galbraith and the cursed entry in the daybook closed his mouth. Hours passed. The class began to arrive. The members of the unhappy Gray were dealt out to one and to another and received without remark. Richardson was made happy with the head, and before the hour of freedom rang, Fetz trembled with exultation to perceive how far they had already gone toward safety. For 2 days he continued to watch with increasing joy the dreadful process of disguise. On the third day, McFarlane made his appearance. He had been ill, he said, but he made up for lost time by the energy with which he directed the students. To Richardson in particular he extended the most valuable of assistance and advice, and that student, encouraged by the praise of his demonstrator, burned high with ambitious hopes and saw the medal already in his grasp. Before the week was out, McFarlane's prophecy had been fulfilled. Fetz had outlived his terrors and had forgotten his baseness. He began to plume himself upon his courage, and had so arranged the story in his mind that he could look back on these events with an unhealthy pride. Of his accomplice he saw but little. They met, of course, in the business of the class. They received their orders together from Mr. K. At times they had a word or two in private, and McFarlane was from first to last particularly kind and jovial. But it was plain that he avoided any reference to their common secret, and even when Fetz whispered to him that he had cast in his lot with the lions and forsworn the lambs, he only signed to him smilingly to hold his peace. At length an occasion arose which threw the pair once more into a closer union. Mr. K was again short of subjects, pupils were eager, and it was a part of this teacher's pretensions to be always well supplied. At the same time there came the news of a burial in the rustic graveyard of Glencorse. Time has little changed the place in question. It stood then, as now, upon a crossroad, out of call of human habitations, and buried fathom deep in the foliage of 6 cedar trees. The cries of the sheep upon the neighboring hills, the streamlets upon either hand, one loudly singing among pebbles, the other dripping furtively from pond to pond, the stir of the wind, and mountainous old flowering chestnuts, and once in 7 days the voice of the bell, and the old tunes of the precentor, were the only sounds that disturbed the silence around the rural church. The Resurrection Man, to use a by-name of the period, was not to be deterred by any of the sanctities of customary piety. It was part of his trade to despise and desecrate the souls and trumpets of old tombs, the paths worn by the feet of worshippers and mourners, and the offerings and the inscriptions of bereaved affection. To rustic neighborhoods, where love is more than commonly tenacious, and where some bonds of blood or fellowship unite the entire society of a parish, the body snatcher, far from being repelled by natural respect, was attracted by the ease and safety of the task. To bodies that had been lain in the earth, in joyful expectation of a far different awakening, there came that hasty, lamp-lit, terror-haunted resurrection of the spade and mattock. The coffin was forced, the cerements torn, the melancholy relics clad in sackcloth, after being rattled for hours on moonless byways, were at length exposed to uttermost indignities before a class of gaping boys. Somewhat as 2 vultures may swoop upon a dying lamb, Frights and MacFarlane were to be let loose upon a grave in that green and quiet resting place. The wife of a farmer, a woman who had lived for 60 years, had been known for nothing but butter and godly conversation, was to be rooted from her grave at midnight and carried, dead and naked, to that faraway city that she had always honored with her Sunday's best. The place beside her family was to be empty till the crack of doom, her innocent and almost venerable members to be exposed to that last curiosity of the anatomist. Late one afternoon, the pair set forth, well wrapped in cloaks and furnished with a formidable bottle. It rained without remission, a cold, dense, lashing rain. Now and again there blew a puff of wind, but these sheets of falling water kept it down. Bottle and all, it was a sad and silent drive as far as Penicuik, where they were to spend the evening. They stopped once to hide their implements in a thick bush not far from the churchyard, and once again at the Fisher's Tryst to have a toast before the kitchen fire and vary their nips of whiskey with a glass of ale. When they reached their journey's end, the gig was housed, the horse was fed and comforted, and the 2 young doctors in a private room sat down to the best dinner and the best wine the house afforded. The lights, the fire, the beating rain upon the window, the cold, incongruous work that lay before them, added zest to their enjoyment of the meal. With every glass, their cordiality increased. Soon, MacFarlane handed a little pile of gold to his companion. "A compliment," he said. "Between friends, these little damned accommodations ought to fly like pipe lights." Frights pocketed the money and applauded the sentiment in echo. "You are a philosopher," he cried. "I was an ass until I knew you. You and Kay, between you, by the Lord Harry, you'll make a man of me." "Of course we shall," applauded MacFarlane. "A man? I tell you, it required a man to come back me up the other morning. There are some big, brawling 40-year-old cowards who would have turned sick at the look of the damned thing. But not you. You kept your head. I watched you." "Well, and why not?" Frights thus vaunted himself. "It was no affair of mine. There was nothing to gain on the one side but disturbance, and on the other I could count on your gratitude, don't you see?" And he slapped his pocket till the gold pieces rang. MacFarlane somehow felt a certain touch of alarm at these unpleasant words. He may have regretted that he had taught his young companion so successfully, but he had no time to interfere, for the other noisily continued in this boastful strain. "The great thing is to not be afraid. Now, between you and me, I don't want to hang, that's practical. But for all cant, MacFarlane, I was born with a contempt. Hell, God, devil, right, wrong, sin, crime, and the old gallery of curiosities. They may frighten boys, but men of the world like you and me despise them. Here's to the memory of Grey. It was by this time growing somewhat late. The gig, according to order, was brought round to the door with both lamps brightly shining, and the young men had to pay their bill and take the road. They announced that they were bound for Peebles, and drove in that direction until they were clear of the last houses of the town. Then, extinguishing the lamps, returned upon their course and followed a by-road toward Glencorse. There was no sound but that of their own passage and the incessant, strident pouring of the rain. It was pitch dark here, and a white gate or white stone in the wall guided them for a short space across the night. For the most part, it was at a foot pace, and almost groping, that they picked their way through the resonant blackness to their solemn and isolated destination. In the sunken woods that traversed the neighborhood of the burying ground, the last glimmer failed them, and became necessary to kindle a match and re-illumine one of the lanterns of the gig. Thus, under the dripping trees, and environed by huge and moving shadows, they reached the scene of their unhallowed labors. They were both experienced in such affairs, and powerful with the spade, and they had scarce been 20 minutes at their task before they were rewarded by a dull rattle on the coffin lid. At the same moment, MacFarlane, having hurt his hand upon a stone, flung it carelessly above his head. The grave, in which they now stood almost to the shoulders, was close to the edge of a plateau of the graveyard, and the gig lamp had been propped the better to illuminate their labors against a tree, and on the immediate verge of the steep bank descending to the stream. Chance had taken a sure aim with the stone. There came a clang of broken glass. Night fell upon them. Sounds alternately dull and ringing announced the bounding of the lantern down the bank and its occasional collision with the trees. A stone or two, which it had dislodged in its descent, rattled behind it into the profundities of the glen, and then silence, like night, resumed its sway, and they might bend their hearing to its utmost pitch, but naught was to be heard except the rain, now marching to the wind, now steadily falling over miles of the open country. They were so nearly at an end of their abhorred task that they judged it wisest to complete it in the dark. The coffin was exhumed and broken open, the body inserted in the dripping sack and carried between them to the gig, one mounted to keep it in its place, and the other, taking the horse by the mouth, groped along by wall and bush until they reached the wider road by the Fisher's Tryst. Here was a faint, diffused radiancy, which they hailed like daylight. By that they pushed their horse to a good pace, and began to rattle along merrily in the direction of the town. They had been wetted to the skin during their operations, and now, as the gig jumped among their deep ruts, the thing that stood propped between them fell now upon one and now upon the other. At every repetition of the horrid contact, each instinctively repelled it with greater haste, and the process, natural though it was, began to tell upon the nerves of the companions. MacFarlane made some ill-favored jest about the farmer's wife, but it came hollowly from his lips and was allowed to drop in silence. Still their unnatural burden bumped from side to side, and now the head would be laid, as if in confidence, upon their shoulders, and now the drenching sackcloth would flap icily about their faces. A creeping chill began to possess the soul of Fettes. He peered at the bundle, and it seemed somehow larger than at first. All over the countryside, and from every degree of distance, the farm dogs accompanied their passage with tragic ululations, and it grew and grew upon his mind that some unnatural miracle had been accomplished, and some nameless change had befallen the dead body, and that it was in fear of their unholy burden that the dogs were howling. "For God's sake," he said, making a great effort to arrive at speech, "for God's sake, let's have a light." Seemingly, MacFarlane was affected by the same direction, for, though he made no reply, he stopped the horse, passed the reins to his companion, got down, and proceeded to kindle the remaining lamp. They had by that time got no farther than the crossroad down to Auchinleckey. The rain still poured as though the deluge were returning, and it was no easy matter to make a light in such a world of wet and darkness. When at last the flickering blue flame had been transferred to the wick, and began to expand and clarify, shed a wide circle of misty brightness round the gig. It became possible for the two young men to see each other and the thing they had along with them. The rain had molded the rough sacking to the outlines of the body underneath. The head was distinct from the trunk, the shoulders plainly modeled. Something at once spectral and human riveted their eyes upon the ghastly comrade of their drive. For some time, McFarlane stood motionless, holding up the lamp. A nameless dread was swathed like a wet sheet about the body, and tightened the white skin upon the face of Fettes. A fear that was meaningless, a horror of what could not be, but kept mounting to his brain. Another beat of the watch, and he had spoken, but his comrade forestalled him. "That is not a woman," said McFarlane in a hushed voice. "It was a woman when we put her in," whispered Fettes. "Hold that lamp," said the other. "I must see her face." And as Fettes took the lamp, his companion untied the fastenings of the sack and drew down the cover from the head. The light fell very clear upon the dark, well-molded features and the smooth-shaven cheeks of a too familiar countenance, often beheld in dreams of both of these young men. A wild yell rang up into the night. Each leapt from his own side into the roadway. The lamp fell, broke, and was extinguished, and the horse, terrified by this unusual commotion, bounded off and went toward Edinburgh at a gallop, bearing along with it, sole occupant of the gig, the body of the dead and long dissected Gray. Excuse me. So that was Robert Louis Stevenson's The Body Snatcher. Now, normally I'd play a song fitting to that, and Creature Features Grave Robber at Large would fit nicely, but it was actually their song that I played last week that inspired me to read that this week. So instead, we're going to make do with The Black Widow by Alice Cooper. So we're going to let Cooper take it away.
Lepidoptera, please don't touch the displays, little boy. Oh, cute. Moving to the next aisle, we have Arachnida, the spiders, our finest collection. This friendly little devil is the Heptathylidae, unfortunately harmless. Next to him, the nasty Lycosa raptoria. His tiny fangs cause creeping ulcerations of the skin. And here, my prize, the Black Widow. Isn't she lovely and so deadly? Her kiss is 15 times as poisonous as that of the rattlesnake. You see, her venom is highly neurotoxic, which is to say that it attacks the central nervous system, causing intense pain, profuse sweating, difficulty in breathing, loss of consciousness, violent convulsions, and finally, death. You know, I think what I love the most about her is her inborn need to dominate, possess. In fact, immediately after the consummation of her marriage to the smaller and weaker male of the species, she kills and eats him. Oh, she is delicious. And I hope he was. Such power and dignity, unhampered by sentiment. If I may put forward a slice of personal philosophy, I feel that man has ruled this world as a stumbling, demented child king long enough. And as his empire crumbles, my precious Black Widow shall rise as his most fitting successor.
These words he speaks are true. We're all humanary stew. We don't pledge allegiance to the Black Widow. The horror that he'll bring, the horror of his sting, the unholiest of kings, the Black Widow. Our minds will be his toy. Every girl and boy will learn to be employed. The Black Widow. Love me, yes we love devoured. He stares with a gleam, with a lamp so obscene, the virgins and the children he's deflowered. Allegiance to the Black Widow.
And that was The Black Widow by Alice Cooper. Interesting choice lyrically. I've always thought that it's we're pledging allegiance to him when Black Widows, the females are the more dangerous, hence widow. They, after they mate, the male offers itself up as nourishment for the female, which won't be able to move during its egg's long gestation period, and then it is cannibalized. In nature, fun. I always thought so. Anywho, up next we got a song by the always delightful Tom Waits. This song is Just the Right Bullets. It's from his album, The Black Rider. It is being sung by a character mentioned in another song, The Flashpan Hunter, which is this album's conception of Satan as a hunter stalking through the earth looking for souls. And here's him singing about how to get them.
There is a light in the forest. There's a face in the tree. I'll pull you out of the chorus, and the first one's always free. You can never go a-hunting with just a flintlock and a hound. You won't go home with a bunting if you blow 100 rounds. It takes much more than wild courage, or you'll hit the tattered clouds. You must have just the right bullets, and the first one's always free. You must be careful in the forest. Broken glass and rusty nails if you're to bring back something for us. I have bullets for sale.
All right, that was Tom Waits' Just the Right Bullets. And we got one more song before we go into the next part with, what is it? The Great God Pan. Up next is a song by Radiohead, who has shown up on this show before because of their delightfully creepy sound. This one's a little less creepy than their usual stuff. It's a little more heavy rock, maybe even metal, you might say. But the lyrics, if you can make them out, are delightfully creepy. It's called myxomatosis, which is a disease, a degenerative brain disease, sort of like rabies, that seems to exclusively affect rabbits. Here we go. That was fun. Okay, so a couple of things that I want to clarify from past things. In the Body Snatcher, there was that comment, I never canted. Voltaire himself may have canted, were he in my boots, but I never did. Canting means to repent, in case you don't know that. And when he references Voltaire, Voltaire was a French philosopher, satirist, writer, and staunch opponent of organized Christianity, especially the Roman Catholic Church. He was a sharp wit. He wrote the book Candide, if anybody had to read that in high school literature. Good book. On his deathbed, though, see, like all of the great opponents of organized religion, Darwin included, it was said that he repented on his deathbed and begged to be allowed back into the church. Of course, all his friends say he didn't. The story his friends tell is that on his deathbed, a priest came to him and told him to renounce Satan, to which point he replied, "My dear sir, now is not the time to be making new enemies," which I've always thought was wonderfully witty, if perhaps a touch improprietous, and definitely more than a little blasphemous, but that's the context for that quote from that. Now, myxomatosis, I believe before the song played I described it as like rabies. I was wrong. It turns out it's screwed up in an entirely different kind of way. From the Wikipedia page, in the rabbits of the genus I'm not gonna try the Latin. Cottontail rabbits living in the Americas, myxomatosis causes only localized skin tumors, but the European rabbit is more severely affected. At first, normally, the disease is visible by lumps, myxomata, and puffiness around the head and genitals. It may progress to acute conjunctivitis, which is better known as pink eye, and possibly blindness. However, this also may be the first visible symptom of the disease. The rabbits become listless, lose appetite, and develop a fever. Secondary bacterial infections occur in most cases, which cause pneumonia and purulent inflammation of the lungs. In cases where the rabbit has little or no resistance, death may take place rapidly, often as little as 48 hours. Most cases result in death within 14 days. Often the symptoms like blindness make the rabbit more invulnerable to predators. In Uruguay, it was a relatively harmless strain of the disease, was used as a, it spread in Uruguay and was used in Australia in a desperate attempt to curb the out-of-control rabbit population. So, yeah. It's caused by the myxoma virus. First observed in Uruguay in laboratory rabbits in the late 19th century. So, and it's spread by insects. Can't spread to humans, though. Rabbit exclusive, as far as we know. Thus far. Since the 19th century, it's only been affecting rabbits, so we're good. Anywho, we're now going to move on to the Great God Pan, now that the brief, unintended educational segment of our show is over. And we had left off with... we had left off with the horrible experiment with an attempt to sever part of the brain to contact the Great God Pan, which resulted in the young girl, the subject, seeing him and then being rendered completely mentally retarded, or incapacitated, technically. No retardation took effect. Incapacitation took effect. We then got a history of a young girl, Helen, who was of a peculiar nature, and whose very wealthy guardian sent her to live elsewhere briefly, for her own good, so she could get fresh air of the countryside. With strict instructions, she could do what she liked, and who was seen by one of her playmates talking with a strange naked man, and then later vanished literally into thin air. And not as in she went out one day and they never saw her again, as in she was witnessed walking along, and then poof, gone. Of course, our hero Clark has kept this in his little book on proof of the devil, but he himself doesn't wish to believe this is possible. And in the last chapter ended with et diabolus incarnatus est et homo facitus est, which I'm going to look up again because I said what it meant last time, but I want to double check for those of you just tuning in. And that translates to, and the devil was made incarnate, and a human being was produced. So that's the note we left off on last time in the Latin. All right, next chapter of The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. The City of Resurrections. Herbert! Good God, is it possible? Yes, my name's Herbert. I think I know your face, too, but I don't remember your name. My memory is very queer. Don't you recollect Villiers of Wadham? So it is. I beg your pardon, Villiers. I didn't think I was begging of an old college friend. Good night. My dear fellow, this haste is unnecessary. My rooms are close by, but we won't go there just yet. Suppose we walk up Shaftesbury Avenue a little way. But how in heaven's name have you come to this pass, Herbert? It's a long story, Villiers, and a strange one, too, but you can hear it if you like. Come on, then. Take my arm, and you don't seem very strong. The ill-assorted pair moved slowly up Rupert Street. the one in dirty, evil-looking rags, and the other attired in the regulation uniform of a man about town, trim, glossy, and eminently well-to-do. Villiers had emerged from his restaurant after an excellent dinner of many courses, assisted by an ingratiating little flask of Chianti. And in that frame of mind, which was with him almost chronic, he had delayed a moment by the door, peering round in the dimly lighted street in search of those mysterious incidents and persons with which the streets of London teem in every quarter and at every hour. Villiers prided himself as a practiced explorer of such obscure mazes and byways of London life, and in this unprofitable pursuit he displayed an assiduity which was worthy of more serious employment. Thus he stood beside the lamp-post, surveying the passers-by with undisguised curiosity, and with that gravity only known to the systematic diner. He had just enunciated in his mind the formula, "London has been called the city of encounters. It is more than that. It is the city of resurrections," when these reflections were suddenly interrupted by a piteous whine at his elbow and a deplorable appeal for alms. He looked round in some irritation, and with a sudden shock found himself confronted with the embodied proof of his somewhat stilted fancies. There, close beside him, his face altered and disfigured by poverty and disgrace, his body barely covered by greasy, ill-fitting rags, stood his old friend, Charles Herbert, who had matriculated on the same day as himself, and with whom he had been merry and wise for 12 revolving terms. Different occupations and varying interests had interrupted the friendship, and it was 6 years since Villiers had seen Herbert. And now he looked upon this wreck of a man with grief and dismay, mingled with a certain inquisitiveness as to what dreary chain of circumstance had dragged him down to such a doleful pass. Villiers felt together with compassion all the relish of the amateur in mysteries, and congratulated himself on his leisurely speculations outside the restaurant. They walked on in silence for some time, and more than one passerby stared in astonishment at the unaccustomed spectacle of a well-dressed man with an unmistakable beggar hanging onto his arm, and, observing this, Villiers led the way to an obscure street in Soho. Here he repeated his question. "How on earth has it happened, Herbert? I always understood you would succeed to an excellent position in Dorsetshire. Did your father disinherit you?" "Surely not." "No, Villiers. I came into all the poverty at my poor father's death. He died a year after I left Oxford. He was a very good father to me, and I mourned his death sincerely enough, but you know what young men are. A few months later I came up to town and went a good deal into society. Of course I had excellent introductions, and I managed to enjoy myself very much in a harmless sort of way. I played a little, certainly, but never for heavy stakes, and the few bets I made on races brought me in money. Only a few pounds, you know, but enough to pay for cigars and such petty pleasures. It was in my second season that the tide turned. Of course, you have heard of my marriage?" "No, I never heard anything about it." "Yes, I married, Villiers. I met a girl of the most wonderful and most strange beauty at the house of some people whom I knew. I cannot tell you her age. I never knew it. But so far as I can guess, I can think she must have been about 19 when I made her acquaintance. My friends had come to know her at Florence. She told them she was an orphan, the child of an English father and an Italian mother. And she charmed them as she charmed me. The first I saw her was at an evening party. I was standing by the door talking to a friend when suddenly, above the hum and the babble of conversation, a voice which seemed to thrill to my heart. She was singing an Italian song. I was introduced to her that evening, and in 3 months I married Helen. Villiers, that woman, if I can call her a woman, corrupted my soul. The night of the wedding, I found myself sitting in her bedroom in the hotel, listening to her talk. She was sitting up in bed, and I listened to her as she spoke, and her beautiful voice spoke of things which even now I would not dare whisper in blackest nights, though I stood in the midst of wilderness. You, Villiers, you may think you know life and London and what goes on day and night in this dreadful city. For all I can say, you may have heard the talk of the vilest But I tell you, you can have no conception of what I know. No, not in your most fantastic, hideous dreams can you have imagined forth the faintest shadow of what I have heard and seen. Yes, seen. I have seen the incredible, such horrors that even I myself sometimes stop in the middle of the street and ask whether it is possible for a man to behold such things and live. In a year, Villiers, I was a ruined man in body and soul. In body and soul. But your property, Herbert. You had land in Dorset. I sold it all. The fields, the woods, the dear old house. Everything. And the money? She took it all from me. And then left you? Yes. She disappeared one night. I don't know where she went, but I am sure if I saw her again, it would kill me. The rest of my story is of no interest. Sordid misery, that is all. You may think, Villiers, that I have exaggerated and talked for effect, but I have not told you half. I could tell you certain things which would convince you, but you would never know a happy day again. You would pass the rest of your life as I pass mine, a haunted man, a man who has seen hell. Villiers took the unfortunate man to his rooms and gave him a meal. Herbert could eat little, and scarcely touched the glass of wine set before him. He sat moody and silent by the fire, and seemed relieved when Villiers sent him away with a small present of money. "By the way, Herbert," said Villiers as they parted at the door, "what was your wife's name? You said Helen, I think? Helen what?" "The name she passed under when I met her was Helen Vaughan, but what her real name was I can't say. I don't think she had a name. No, not in that sense. Only human beings have names, Villiers. I can't say any more. Goodbye. Yes, I will not fail to call if I see any way in which you can help me. Good night." The man went out into the bitter night, and Villiers returned to his fireside. There was something about Herbert which shocked him inexpressibly. Not his poor rags or the marks which poverty had set upon his face, but rather an indefinite terror which hung about him like a mist. He had acknowledged that he himself was not devoid of blame. The woman he had avowed had corrupted him body and soul, and Villiers felt that this man, once his friend, had been an actor in scenes evil beyond the power of words. His story needed no confirmation. He himself was the embodied proof of it. Villiers mused curiously over the story he had heard, and wondered whether he had heard both the first and the last of it. No, he thought, certainly not the last, probably only the beginning. A case like this is like a nest of Chinese boxes. You open one after another and find a quainter workmanship in every box. Most likely poor Herbert is merely one of the outside boxes. There are stranger ones to follow. Villiers could not take his mind away from Herbert and his story, which seemed to grow wilder as the night wore on. The fire began to burn low, and the chilly air of the morning crept into the room. Villiers got up with a glance over his shoulder, and shivering slightly, went to bed. A few days later he saw at the club a gentleman of his acquaintance named Austin, who was famous for his intimate knowledge of London life, both in its tenebrous and luminous phases. Villiers, still full of his encounter in Soho and its consequences, that thought Austin might possibly be able to shed some light on Herbert's history, and so, after some casual talk, he suddenly put the question, "Do you happen to know anything of a man named Herbert? Charles Herbert?" Austin turned round sharply and stared at Villiers with some astonishment. "Charles Herbert? Weren't you in town 3 years ago?" "No. Then you have not heard of the Paul Street case? It caused a great deal of sensation at the time." "What was the case?" "Well, a gentleman, a man of very good position, was found dead, stark dead, in the area of a certain house in Paul Street off Tottenham Court Road. Of course, the police did not make the discovery. If you happen to be sitting up all night and have a light in your window, the constable will ring the bell, but if you happen to be lying dead in somebody's area, you will be left alone. In this instance, as many others, the alarm was raised by some kind of vagabond. I don't mean a common tramp or a public house loafer, but a gentleman whose business or pleasure or both made him a... Excuse me for a moment. Sorry, tickle in my throat. Where was I? But a gentleman whose business or pleasure or both made him a spectator of the London streets at 5 o'clock in the morning. This individual was, as he said, going home. It did not appear whence or whither, and had occasion to pass through Paul Street before 4 and 5 a.m. Something or other caught his eye at number 20. He said, absurdly enough, that the house had the most unpleasant physiognomy he had ever observed, but at any rate, he glanced down the area, and was a good deal astonished to see a man lying on the stones, his limbs all huddled together and his face turned up. Our gentleman thought this face looked peculiarly ghastly, so set off at a run in search of the nearest policeman. The constable was at first inclined to treat the matter lightly, suspecting a mere drunken freak. However, he came, and after looking at the man's face, changed his tone quickly enough. The early bird, who had picked up this fine worm, was sent off for a doctor, and the policeman rang and knocked at the door till a slatternly servant girl came down, looking more than half asleep. The constable pointed out the contents of the area to the maid, who screamed loudly enough to wake up the street, but she knew nothing of the man, had never seen him at the house, and so forth. Meanwhile, the original discoverer had come back with a medical man, and the next thing was to get into the area. The gate was open, so the whole quartet stumped down the stairs. The doctor hardly needed a moment's examination. He said the poor fellow had been dead for several hours, and he was moved away to a police station for the time being. It was then that the case began to get interesting. The dead man had not been robbed, and in one of his pockets were papers identifying him as well as a man of good family and means, favored in society and nobody's enemy, so far as could be known. I don't give his name, Villiers, because it has nothing to do with the story, and because it's no good raking up these affairs about the dead when their relations are living. The next curious part was that the medical men couldn't agree as to how he met his death. There were some slight bruises on his shoulders, but they were so slight that it looked as if he had been pushed roughly out of the kitchen door and not thrown over the railings from the street or even dragged down the steps. But there were positively no other marks of violence upon him, certainly none that would account for his death. And when they came to autopsy, there wasn't a trace of poison of any kind. Of course, the police wanted to know all about the people at number 20, and here again, so I have heard from private sources, one or two other very curious points came out. It appears that the occupants of the house were Mr. and Mrs. Charles Herbert. He was said to be a landed proprietor, though it struck most people that Paul Street was not exactly the place to look for country gentry. As for Mrs. Herbert, nobody seemed to know who or what she was, and between ourselves, I fancy the divers after her history found themselves in rather strange waters. Of course, they both denied knowing anything about the deceased, and in default of any evidence against them, they were discharged. But some very odd things came about them. Though it was between 5 and 6 in the morning when the dead man was removed, a large crowd had collected, and several of the neighbors ran to see what was going on. They were pretty free with their comments, by all accounts, and from these it appeared that number 20 was in a very bad odor in Paul Street. The detectives tried to trace down these rumors to some solid foundation of fact, but could not get hold of anything. People shook their heads and raised their eyebrows and thought the Herberts rather queer, who would not rather be seen going into their house, and so on, but there was nothing tangible. The authorities were morally certain that the man met his death in some way or another in the house and was thrown out by the kitchen door, but they couldn't prove it, and the absence of any indications of violence or poisoning left them helpless. An odd case, wasn't it? But curiously enough, there's something more that I haven't told you. I happen to know one of the doctors who was consulted as to the cause of death, and sometime after the inquest I met him and asked him about it. "Do you really mean to tell me," I said, "that you were baffled by the case, that you actually don't know what the man died of?" "Pardon me," he replied. I know perfectly well what caused death. Blank died of fright, sheer awful terror. I never saw features so hideously contorted in the entire course of my practice, and I have seen the faces of a whole host of dead. The doctor was the doctor was usually a cool customer enough, and a certain vehemence in his manner struck me, but I couldn't get any more out of him. I suppose the Treasury didn't see their way to prosecuting the Herberts for frightening a man to death at any rate. Nothing was done, and the case dropped out of men's minds. Do you happen to know anything of Herbert? Well, replied Villiers, he was an old college friend of mine. You don't say so. Have you ever seen his wife? No, I haven't. I have lost sight of Herbert for many years. It's queer, isn't it? Parting with a man at the college gate or at Paddington, seeing nothing of him for years, and then finding him pop up his head in such an odd place. But I should like to have seen Mrs. Herbert. People said extraordinary things about her. What sort of things? Well, I hardly know how to tell you. Everyone who saw her at the police court said she was at once the most beautiful woman and the most repulsive they had ever set eyes on. I have spoken to a man who saw her, and I assure you he positively shuddered as he tried to describe the woman, but he couldn't tell why. She seems to have been a sort of enigma, and I expect that one dead man could have told tales, he would have told some uncommonly queer ones. And there you are again in another puzzle. What could a respectable country gentleman like Mr. Blank, we'll call him that if you don't mind, want in such a very queer house as number 20? It's altogether a very odd case, isn't it? It is indeed, Austin, an extraordinary case. I didn't think, when I asked you about it, my old friend, I should strike on such a strange metal. Well, I must be off. Good day. Villiers went away, thinking of his own conceit of the Chinese boxes. Here was quaint workmanship, indeed. The Discovery in Paul Street. A few months after Villiers' meeting with Herbert, Mr. Clark was sitting, as usual, by his after-dinner hearth, resolutely guarding his fancies from wandering in the direction of the bureau. For more than a week he had succeeded in keeping away from the memoirs, and he cherished hopes of a complete self-reformation, but in spite of his endeavors he could not hush the wonder and strange curiosity that last case he had written down had excited within him. He had put the case, or rather the outline of it, conjecturally to a scientific friend, who shook his head and thought Clark getting queer, and on this particular evening Clark was making an effort to rationalize the story, when a sudden knock at his door roused him from his meditations. "Mr. Villiers to see you, sir." Dear me, Villiers, is very kind of you to look me up. I have not seen you for many months. I should think nearly a year. Come in, come in. And how are you, Villiers? Want any advice about investments? No, thanks. I fancy everything I have in that way is pretty safe. No, Clark, I have really come to consult you about a rather curious matter that has been brought under my notice of late. I'm afraid you will think it all rather absurd when I tell you my tale. I sometimes think so myself, and that's just why I made up my mind to come to you, as I know you're a practical man. Mr. Villiers was ignorant of the memoirs to prove the existence of the devil. Well, Villiers, I shall be happy to give you my advice to the best of my ability. What is the nature of the case? It's an extraordinary thing altogether. You know my ways. I always keep my eyes open in the streets, and in my time I have chanced upon some queer customers and queer cases too, but this, I think, beats all. I was coming out of a restaurant one nasty night, about 3 months ago, and I had had a capital dinner, and a good bottle of Chianti, and I stood for a moment on the pavement, thinking what a mystery there is about London streets and the companies that pass along them. A bottle of red wine encourages these fancies, Clarks, and I dare say I should have thought a page of small type, but I was cut short by a beggar who had come behind me and was making the usual appeals. Of course I looked round, and this beggar turned out to be what was left of an old friend of mine, a man named Herbert. I asked him how he had come to such a wretched pass, and he told me. We walked up and down one of those long, dark Soho streets, and there I listened to his story. He said he had married a beautiful girl, some years younger than himself, and, as he put it, she'd corrupted him body and soul. He wouldn't go into details. He said he dare not, that what he had seen and heard haunted him by night and day, and when I looked in his face, I knew he was speaking the truth. There was something about the man that made me shiver. I don't know why, but when he was gone, I gasped for breath. I don't know why, but it was there. I gave him a little money and sent him away. I assure you, when he was gone, I gasped for breath. His presence seemed to chill one's blood. Isn't this all just a little fanciful, Villiers? I suppose the poor fellow had made an imprudent marriage and, in plain English, gone to the bad. Well, listen to this. Villiers told Clark the story he had heard from Austin. You see, he concluded, there can be but little doubt that this Mr. Blank, whoever he was, died of sheer terror. He saw something awful, so terrible, that it cut short his life. And what he saw, he most certainly saw in that house, which somehow or other had got a bad name in the neighborhood. I had the curiosity to go and look at the place myself. It's a saddening kind of street. The houses are old enough to be mean and dreary, but not old enough to be quaint. As far as I could see, most of them are let-in lodgings, furnished and unfurnished, and almost every door has 3 bells to it. Here and there the ground floors have been made into shops of the commonest kind. It's a dismal street in every way. I found number 20 was to let and went to the agents and got the key. Of course, I should have heard nothing of the Herberts in that quarter, but I asked the man, fair and square, how long they have left the house, and whether there had been other tenants in the meanwhile. He looked at me queerly for a minute, and told me the Herberts had left immediately after the unpleasantness, as he called it, and since then the house had been empty. Mr. Villiers paused for a moment. I have always been rather fond of going over empty houses. There's a sort of fascination about the desolate empty rooms, with the nails sticking in the walls and the dust thick upon the windowsills. But I didn't enjoy going over number 20 Paul Street. I'd hardly put my foot inside the passage before I noticed a queer, heavy feeling about the air of the house. Of course, all empty houses are stuffy and so forth, but this was something quite different. I can't describe it to you, but it seemed to stop the breath. I went into the front room, and the back room, and the kitchens downstairs. They were all dirty and dusty enough, as you would expect, but there was something strange about them all. I couldn't define it to you. I only know I felt queer. It was one of the rooms on the first floor, though that was the worst. It was a largish room, and once on a time the paper must have been cheerful enough, but when I saw it, paint, paper, and everything were most doleful. But the room was full of horror. I felt my teeth grinding as I put my hand on the door, and when I went in, I thought I should have fallen fainting to the floor. However, I pulled myself together and stood against the end wall, wondering what on earth there could be about the room to make my limbs tremble, and my heart beat as if I were at the hour of death. In one corner there was a pile of newspapers littered about on the floor. I began looking at them. They were papers of 3 or 4 years ago, some of them half torn, some crumpled, as if they had been used for packing. I turned the whole pile over, and amongst them I found a curious drawing. I will show it to you presently. But I couldn't stay in the room. I felt it was overpowering me. I was thankful to come out safe and sound into the open air. People stared at me as I walked along the street. I've lost my place. Along the street, and one man said I was drunk. I was staggering about from one side of the pavement to the other, and it was as much as I could do to take the key back to the agent and get home. I was in bed for a week, suffering from what my doctor called nervous shock and exhaustion. One of those days, I was reading the evening paper, and happened to notice a paragraph headed, "Starved to Death." It was the usual style of thing, a model lodging house in Marylebone, a door locked for several days, and a dead man in his chair when they broke in. The deceased, said the paragraph, was known as Charles Herbert, and is believed to have been once a prosperous country gentleman. His name was familiar to the public 3 years ago, in connection with the mysterious death in Paul Street, Tottenham Court Road, the deceased being the tenant of the house in number 20, in the area of which a gentleman of good position was found dead under circumstances not devoid of suspicion. A tragic ending, wasn't it? But after all, if what he told me were true, which I am sure it was, the man's life was all a tragedy, and a tragedy of a stranger sort than they put on the boards. "And that is the story, is it?" said Clark musingly. Yes, that is the story. Well, really, Villiers, I scarcely know what to say about it. There are no doubt circumstances in the case which seem peculiar. The finding of the dead man in the area of the Herbert's house, for instance, and the extraordinary opinion of the physician as to the cause of death. But after all, it is conceivable that the facts may be explained in a straightforward manner. As to your own sensations when you went to see the house, I would suggest they were due to a vivid imagination. You must have been brooding in a semi-conscious way over what you had heard. I don't exactly see what more can be said or done in the matter. You evidently think there is a mystery of some kind, but Herbert is dead. Where do you propose to look? I propose to look for the woman whom he married. She is the mystery. The two... Excuse me. The two men sat silent by the fireside, Clark secretly congratulating himself on having successfully kept up the character of an advocate of the commonplace, and Villiers wrapped up in his gloomy fantasies. I think I will have a cigarette, he said at last, and put his hand in his pocket to feel for the cigarette case. Ah, he said, starting slightly. I forgot I had something to show you. You remember my saying that I had felt a rather curious sketch amongst the pile of old newspapers at the house in Paul Street? Here it is, pardon me again. Villiers drew out a small thin parcel from his pocket. It was covered with brown paper and secured with string, and the knots were troublesome. In spite of himself, Clark felt inquisitive. He bent forward on his chair as Villiers painfully undid the string and unfolded the outer covering. Inside was a second wrapping of tissue, and Villiers took it off and handed the small piece of paper to Clark without a word. There was dead silence in the room for 5 minutes or more. Oh dear. Or more. The two men sat so still that they could hear the ticking of the tall, old-fashioned clock that stood outside in the hall, and in the mind of one of them the slow monotony of sound woke up a far, far memory. He was looking intently at the small pen-and-ink sketch of a woman's head. It had evidently been drawn with great care and by a true artist, for the woman's soul looked out of the eyes, and the lips were parted with a strange smile. Clark gazed still at the face. It brought to his memory one summer evening long ago. He saw again the long, lovely valley, the river winding between the hills, the meadows and the cornfields, the dull red sun and the cold white mist rising from the water. He heard a voice speaking to him across the waves of many years, saying, "Clark, Mary will see the great god Pan." And then he was standing in the grim room beside the doctor, listening to the heavy ticking of the clock, waiting and watching the figure lying on the green chair beneath the lamplight. Mary rose up, and he looked into her eyes, and his heart grew cold within him. "Who is this woman?" he said at last. His voice was dry and hoarse. "That is the woman whom Herbert married." Clark looked again at the sketch. It was not Mary, after all. There certainly was Mary's face, but there was something else, something he had not seen on Mary's features when the white-clad girl entered the laboratory with the doctor, nor at her terrible awakening, nor when she lay grinning on the bed. Whatever it was, the glance that came from those eyes, the smile and the full lips, or the expression of the whole face, Clark shuddered before it in his inmost soul, and thought unconsciously of Dr. Phillips' words, "The most vivid presentiment of evil I have ever seen." He turned the paper over mechanically in his hand and glanced at the back. "Good God! Clark, what is the matter? You're as white as death." Villiers had started wildly from his chair as Clark fell back with a groan and let the paper drop from his hands. "I don't feel very well, Villiers. I am subject to these attacks. Pour me out a little wine, thanks, that will do. I shall be better in a few minutes. Villiers picked up the fallen sketch and turned it over as Clark had done. You know what? He said. That's how I identified it, as being a portrait of Herbert's wife, or should I say his widow. How do you feel now? Better, thanks. It was only a passing faintness. I don't think I quite catch your meaning. What did you say enabled you to identify the picture? This word, Helen, written on the back. Didn't I tell you her name was Helen? Yes. Helen Vaughan. Clark groaned. There could be no shadow of a doubt. Now, don't you agree with me, said Villiers, that in the story I have told you tonight, and in the part this woman plays in it, there are some very strange points? Yes, Villiers, Clark muttered. It is a strange story indeed, a strange story indeed. You must give me time to think it over. I may be able to help you, or I may not. Must you be going now? Well, good night, Villiers, good night. Come and see me in the course of a week. And we managed to just finish that last chapter on the nick of time. Perfect. We will resume next week with the next chapter of The Great God Pan, titled The Letter of Advice. Until then, as always, I have been your host, Peter Yakovetsky. I hope you've all had a pleasant evening and continue to have a wonderful night and the rest of your week. This has been Moonlight Frights. Cheerio.